The forest was silent, but Elira's voice could hear her own heartbeat like a drum inside her chest. She pressed her back against the cold bark of an old oak tree and closed her eyes, counting the seconds. Somewhere behind her, torches moved through the trees. Voices called out numbers, names, orders. Tonight was the night every wolf in the Blackthorn Kingdom had been waiting for. Tonight was the mating run. And Elira was the only one running the other way. She had trained for this moment for 3 years. Ever since she turned 16 and her gift revealed itself, she had practiced pulling her scent inward, folding it away like a letter tucked into a locked drawer. Other wolves could smell fear, joy, hunger, and love from a mile away. But nobody could smell Elira unless she allowed it. Tonight, she allowed nothing. The kingdom's law was simple and absolute. Every unmated wolf between the ages of 18 and 25 had to attend the run. It did not matter if you were a soldier, a baker, or a farmer's daughter. When the Alpha King called, you answered, because the run was the only way a king found his fated mate. And this year, the king was Kate Thornwood, a name that made even seasoned warriors lower their eyes. Elira had never seen him in person, only heard the stories. He had taken the throne at 23 after his father was killed in a border skirmish with a rival pack. Within 2 years, Cade had folded 3 neighboring territories into his kingdom, some through treaties, some through conflict nobody liked to talk about in detail. He was known for his discipline, his silence, and his eyes, which people said could freeze a man's blood before he ever raised a hand. Nobody defied him. Nobody except, tonight, one Omega girl with a gift for disappearing. She moved low through the brush, her bare feet silent on the damp earth. She had left her shoes at the edge of the forest on purpose, in case trackers came looking for footprints matching a particular shoe size. She wore a plain brown cloak, nothing that would catch torchlight, and she had smeared crushed herbs across her wrist and throat, an old trick her grandmother had taught her before she passed. The herbs would not fool a wolf's nose completely, but paired with her gift, they created a wall no ordinary tracker could break through. Behind her, the horn sounded again, low and mournful, calling every wolf back toward the central clearing where the run would soon begin. Elira knew the schedule by heart because everyone in the kingdom did. At midnight, the king would step onto the raised platform in the clearing, and the wolves would begin to shift and circle, waiting for that one, singular pull that every wolf feared and hoped for at the same time, the pull toward a mate chosen not by choice but by fate itself. Elira did not want fate. She wanted her own life. She had grown up in a small village on the eastern edge of the kingdom, raised by her aunt after her parents died in a fever outbreak when she was 7. Her aunt had taught her to sew, to garden, to survive on very little, and most importantly, to never draw attention to herself. Omegas who stood out disappeared in this kingdom, sometimes taken as brides for wolves who did not care whether the bond was real or forced. Elira had watched it happen to her older cousin, Nora, who had been paired with a brutal lieutenant 3 years ago and had not smiled once since. Elira refused to let that be her story. She reached the edge of the forest just as the moon slid fully behind a bank of clouds, and for a moment, the world went dark enough that she nearly ran straight into a fence post. She caught herself, breathing hard, and looked back one last time at the glow of torchlight rising from the direction of the palace. Thousands of wolves would be gathering there now, nervous energy crackling through the crowd like static before a storm. She almost felt sorry for them. Almost. A twig snapped somewhere to her left. Elira froze completely, every muscle locked, her breath caught halfway in her throat. She turned her head slowly, scanning the darkness. For 3 long seconds, nothing moved. Then a rabbit darted out from beneath a fallen log and vanished into the underbrush, and Elira nearly laughed with relief, except laughing was dangerous too. Sound carried at night, especially to wolf ears. She kept moving, faster now, following the dry creek bed that would lead her toward the border town of Ashwick, nearly 2 days' walk from the palace. She had a cousin there, distant, someone who would not ask too many questions if Elira arrived asking for shelter and a new name. She had been planning this escape for months, saving coins, memorizing maps, learning which patrol routes the king's guards favored during border months. Nothing was left to chance. By the time the sky began to lighten with the first grey hint of dawn, Elira had put nearly 6 miles between herself and the palace. Her legs ached and her feet were raw, but she did not stop. She knew that somewhere behind her, the run had likely ended by now, and questions would already be forming. Someone would notice an Omega girl missing from the registry. Someone would report it. And if the king's wolf had truly failed to find its mate during the run, as she suspected might happen because of her absence, there would be no rest until an explanation was found. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that a king with an entire kingdom to run would not spend his time chasing one missing girl from a border village nobody had ever heard of. Kings had bigger problems. Kings had armies, treaties, harvests, and a throne to protect. Surely he would simply choose another wolf from the gathering, someone whose scent had called to him even faintly, and move forward with his duties as though nothing unusual had happened. She did not yet understand how wrong she was. Miles away, inside the great stone hall of the Blackthorn Palace, King Cade Thornwood stood motionless at the center of the empty clearing long after every other wolf had returned to their homes. The torches had burned low. The musicians had stopped playing hours ago. His advisors had tried twice to coax him back inside, and twice he had ignored them completely, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the darkness beyond the clearing's edge. Something had happened during the run that had never happened before in the history of the Blackthorn Kingdom. For one brief moment, right as the moon reached its highest point, Cade's wolf had surged forward inside him with a force so violent it nearly knocked him from his feet. A scent, faint and fleeting, had brushed against his senses like a whisper carried on wind, gone before he could turn his head to find its source. It was not one of the hundreds of wolves gathered in the clearing. It was something else entirely, something that called to a part of him he did not know existed until that very second. And then it vanished. Not faded. Not weakened. Vanished, as though someone had reached out and simply erased it from the air. Cade had spent the following hours questioning everyone near the edges of the gathering, his voice sharp with a controlled fury that made even his most loyal guards shift uncomfortably. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Nobody remembered a girl leaving early, or a shadow slipping into the trees, or anything at all beyond the ordinary chaos of thousands of wolves gathered in one place. Whoever she was, she had planned this with extraordinary care. His advisor, an older wolf named Peter Ellison who had served 3 generations of Thornwood kings, approached cautiously as dawn broke over the palace walls. "My lord," Peter said carefully, perhaps the bond was simply too faint to matter. Perhaps it was nothing at all, a trick of the wind and too much wine at the feast. Cade turned to look at him, and something in his eyes made Peter take an involuntary step backward. "I have led armies since I was 19 years old," Cade said quietly. "I have felt exhaustion, hunger, and grief. I know precisely what those feelings are, and I know they are not what I felt tonight." That was a mate bond, Peter. That was real. And it is gone, hidden somewhere within my own kingdom, by someone clever enough to escape thousands of trained wolves without leaving a single trace. Peter said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. "Find her," Cade continued, his voice low and steady, more dangerous for its calm than any shout could have been. "I do not care how long it takes. I do not care what resources it requires. Send trackers to every village, every border town, every farm within 100 miles. Someone left that clearing tonight who should not have. Someone with a gift strong enough to mask a mate bond does not vanish without leaving questions behind them. Find those questions. Find their answers. And find her." Word spread through the palace by midday. The king's mate had been present at the run and had escaped before the bond could take hold. Servants whispered it in the kitchens. Guards murmured it in the barracks. By evening, riders were already leaving the capital in every direction, carrying orders that would soon turn the entire kingdom into a hunting ground with only one prize worth finding. Far away, in the quiet hush of the eastern forest, Elira Voss had no idea that her escape had already become the most urgent search in Blackthorn history. She only knew that her legs were tired, her stomach was empty, and Ashwick was still a full day's walk away. She adjusted her cloak, checked the position of the rising sun to confirm her direction, and kept walking, believing with all her heart that she had left the danger behind her. She had not. She had only just begun to be hunted by a king who had never once, in his entire life, learned how to lose. The trackers left the palace within hours, riding hard toward every corner of the kingdom, but King Kate Thornwood did not sit in his throne room and wait for reports to trickle back to him. That was not who he was. He had built his reputation on the battlefield, not behind a desk, and he intended to lead this search the same way he led every campaign, from the front. Peter Ellison tried to stop him, of course. "My lord, you cannot ride out yourself. There are treaties to sign this week, a border dispute with the Ravenshaw Park that requires your presence, and the Eastern Harvest Report still need your seal. A king does not abandon his duties to chase a single missing girl." "She is not a single missing girl," Kate said, pulling on his riding gloves with sharp, efficient movements. "She is my mate. And every duty I hold as king exists because a kingdom needs an heir, a stable throne, and a bonded pair to lead it. I cannot fulfill any of those duties without her. Sign the treaties yourself if you must. I trust your judgment. But I will not sit inside these walls while she slips further away." Peter opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it. He had served Kate's father, and he had learned long ago that once a Thornwood king made a decision, further argument only wasted breath. Instead, he nodded and began organizing the council to handle affairs in the king's absence, praying silently that this search would not take as long as he feared it might. Kate rode out with a small group of his most trusted men, no more than a dozen, chosen specifically because they knew how to move quickly and quietly through unfamiliar territory. Among them was a wolf named Daniel Ashford, a tracker whose nose was second only to Kate's own, and a sharp-eyed young soldier named Owen Blackwell who had grown up in the border regions and knew the back roads better than anyone in the capital. "Where do we start, my lord?" Daniel asked as they paused at a crossroads outside the palace grounds. Kate closed his eyes and tried to recall the exact moment the scent had touched him during the run. It had come from the northeast side of the clearing, faint but unmistakable, carrying a hint of something herbal, something like crushed sage mixed with an underlying sweetness he could not quite place. "Northeast," he said finally. "Toward the border villages. Whoever she is, she did not travel far to reach the run. Most wolves who attend from beyond 50 miles arrive the day before and stay in the guest halls. If she left quickly and quietly, she likely knows this region well enough to move through it without guidance." They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping at small villages along the way to ask careful, casual questions. Had anyone seen a young woman traveling alone? Had anyone noticed unusual absences after the run? The villagers were polite but mostly unhelpful, either because they genuinely knew nothing or because something in the back of their minds warned them not to volunteer information about a runaway to armed men riding under the king's banner. By the third village, Kate began to sense a pattern. Wherever they stopped, people seemed slightly too calm, slightly too practiced in their ignorance. It was not proof of anything, but years of leading soldiers into negotiations and conflicts had sharpened his instincts for when people were hiding something, even something small. "They know more than they say," he murmured to Daniel as they left the third village behind. "Perhaps they fear the girl will be punished," Daniel offered. "Running from the run is not technically forbidden, but it is unheard of. People may simply be protecting one of their own without realizing how serious this search truly is." Kate said nothing, but the thought settled uncomfortably in his chest. He had not considered how his own reputation might be working against him in this search. If villagers believed their king to be as ruthless as the stories claimed, they would have every reason to protect a missing girl from him rather than help him find her. The realization did not sit well, though he pushed it aside for now. There would be time to examine his own reputation later. Right now, he needed answers. Meanwhile, Elira had reached Ashwick 2 days earlier than expected, having pushed herself harder than she planned in order to put distance between herself and the palace as quickly as possible. Her cousin, a quiet woman named Clara Whitmore who ran a small textile shop near the town's edge, had taken her in without asking too many questions, exactly as Elira had hoped. "You look exhausted," Clara said, setting a bowl of stew in front of her at the small kitchen table. "And thinner than I remember. What happened?" Elira wrapped her hands around the warm bowl, grateful for the heat against her cold fingers. "I ran from the mating run," she said simply. There was no point lying to family, especially family who had already agreed to shelter her without knowing the details. Clara's eyebrows rose, but she did not look shocked, only concerned. That is a dangerous thing to do, Elira. The king does not take kindly to wolves who defy the kingdom's laws. I did not defy any law, Elira said, though her voice wavered slightly. Attendance is required. I attended. I simply left before the bonding could take hold. And you think that distinction will matter to him if he catches you? Elira did not have an answer for that, so she said nothing, focusing instead on her stew and trying not to think about torchlight and horns and the terrible weight of thousands of wolves gathered in one place, all waiting for a king to choose among them. She told herself, over the following days, that she had made the right decision. Ashwick was quiet, far enough from the capital that news traveled slowly, and Clara's shop gave her a reason to stay busy, sorting fabric and helping with simple mending work that kept her hands occupied and her mind, mostly, at ease. She adopted a new name for the town, calling herself Ellen, and kept her interactions with strangers brief and unremarkable. But the peace did not last. On the 5th day after her arrival, Elira was walking through the town's small market square, a basket of thread and buttons balanced against her hip, when she felt it, a prickling sensation along the back of her neck, the kind of feeling that made every instinct in her body go alert at once. She turned slowly, scanning the crowded square, and saw nothing unusual, only merchants calling out prices and children weaving between stalls. But the feeling did not fade. She quickened her pace toward Clara's shop, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease, and only relaxed once the shop door closed safely behind her. Clara looked up from her sewing table, immediately noticing the tension in Elira's shoulders. "What is it?" "Nothing," Elira said, though she did not fully believe it herself. "I thought I felt something." It was probably nothing. But it was not nothing, and deep down, some quiet part of her already knew it. 3 days later, riders wearing the king's colors arrived in Ashwick, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath at once. Kate dismounted at the edge of the market square, his presence immediately drawing attention despite his plain traveling clothes, which lacked the usual golden trim of royal garments. There was something about the way he moved, controlled and deliberate, that made people instinctively step aside without being asked. Daniel and Owen flanked him, both scanning the crowd with the sharp, assessing eyes of trained soldiers. "Anything?" Kate asked quietly as they walked further into the square. Daniel inhaled slowly, testing the air the way trackers were trained to do, separating scent from scent with careful precision. "Too many people, my lord. Too much noise in the air. If she passed through here, it would take time to isolate anything useful." Kate nodded, though frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. 5 villages in 5 days, and nothing concrete to show for it. He was beginning to understand just how skilled this girl's gift truly was, and against his own will, a grudging respect had started to form alongside his frustration. Whoever she was, she had outmaneuvered his best trackers repeatedly, using nothing but careful planning and an extraordinary talent for hiding. They spent the afternoon questioning shopkeepers and townsfolk, the same careful, casual approach they had used in previous villages. Most people answered honestly, having no reason to hide anything, since as far as they knew, no unusual newcomers had settled in Ashwick recently. Inside her cousin's shop, Elira watched through the front window as the king's men moved through the square, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. She recognized the royal colors immediately, and though she had never seen Kate Thornwood in person, something about the tall figure at the center of the group made her breath catch in a way she could not explain. "Stay in the back room," Clara whispered urgently, already moving to block the front window from view. "I will handle anything if they come here." Elira retreated without argument, her mind racing. She pressed herself against the wall of the small storage room, listening to muffled voices drift from the front of the shop as the search moved closer, stall by stall, shop by shop, drawing nearer to where she hid with every passing minute. She closed her eyes and focused every ounce of concentration on pulling her scent inward, tighter and more controlled than she had ever managed before, praying silently that it would be enough to keep her hidden from a king who, she was beginning to realize, might never stop searching until he found her. The footsteps outside the shop grew closer, then stopped. Elira heard the small bell above the front door chime as it opened, followed by Clara's voice, warm and steady, greeting the newcomers as though they were ordinary customers rather than the king's personal guard. "Good afternoon. Are you looking for anything in particular?" We have fine wool from the northern farms, just arrived this week. We are simply asking questions in every shop along the square, came a man's voice, calm but firm. Elira recognized it as belonging to one of the guards, not the king himself. Have you noticed any new faces in town over the past week? A young woman, unfamiliar, arriving alone or with few belongings. Ashwick sees travelers often enough, Clara replied smoothly. Merchants passing through, families visiting relatives. Nothing unusual that I recall. There was a pause, long enough that Elira's chest tightened painfully. Then the guard spoke again. Thank you for your time. The bell chimed once more as the door closed, and Elira allowed herself a shaky breath, though she did not move from a hiding spot for several long minutes, waiting until she was certain the danger had truly passed. Clara appeared in the doorway of the storage room a short while later, her face pale but composed. They are moving toward the bakery now. I do not think they suspect anything, but Elira, this cannot continue. If the king himself is leading this search, he will not simply give up and return home. You saw him standing in the square. That was not a man who intends to lose. Elira sank onto an overturned crate, suddenly feeling every mile of her journey pressing down on her shoulders at once. What choice do I have, Clara? I cannot go back. I cannot become his mate simply because fate decided it should be so. I have seen what happens to wolves paired against their will. I watched it happen to Nora. I am not suggesting you go back, Clara said gently, kneeling beside her. I am only saying that hiding in the same town where his men are actively searching may not be wise for much longer. Perhaps it is time to move further, somewhere they have not yet thought to look. Elira nodded slowly, though the thought of continuing to run, alone, exhausted, and now truly frightened for the first time since her escape, filled her with a heaviness she had not expected. She had planned for the difficulty of living. She had not fully planned for the difficulty of staying gone. That evening, after the king's men had finished their questioning throughout the square and retreated to the town's only inn for the night, Elira found herself unable to sleep. She lay on the small cot in Clara's back room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment she had glimpsed Kate Thornwood through the shop window. She had expected, based on the stories, someone cold and severe, perhaps even cruel in his bearing. What she had seen instead was a man who moved like someone carrying an enormous weight, controlled but clearly exhausted, his eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed less like anger and more like desperation. She told herself it did not matter what he looked like, or how he carried himself, or what expression crossed his face as he searched the square. He was still the king who had conquered 3 packs by force. He was still the reason Omegas across the kingdom lived in quiet fear of the mating run. Whatever softness she thought she had glimpsed in his features meant nothing next to the power he held and the way that power had been used before. And yet, sleep did not come easily that night. The following morning, restless and unable to remain hidden in the shop any longer, Elira decided to walk to the town's edge where the local market held its weekly trade day, hoping the larger crowd would provide enough cover to move unnoticed. Clara warned her against it, but Elira insisted, arguing that staying locked inside the shop only made her feel more like a prisoner than the crown ever could. The trade market buzzed with activity, merchants from surrounding villages setting up stores selling grain, cloth, tools, and livestock. Elira moved carefully through the crowd, keeping her head low and her pace unhurried, exactly as she had trained herself to do over the past week. She had almost reached the far end of the market, intending to purchase a few supplies before returning to the shop, when she rounded a corner between 2 stores and nearly collided directly with someone walking the opposite direction. "Forgive me," she said quickly, stepping back and lowering her eyes out of habit. "The fault was mine," came a low, steady voice. Elira looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her, dressed in plain traveling clothes that did nothing to hide the quiet authority in his posture, was the very man she had seen through Clara's shop window the day before. Up close, his eyes were a deep, striking gray, sharp and assessing, though something flickered across his expression as he looked at her, a brief flash of confusion, as though he were trying to place something just out of reach. "Are you all right?" he asked, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary. "Yes, of course," Elira said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "I was not watching where I walked." He studied her for a long moment, and Elira felt an inexplicable pull toward him, something warm and unsettling that made no sense given everything she knew about this man. She told herself it was simply fear, adrenaline from nearly walking directly into the very person haunting her, but some quieter part of her recognized it as something else entirely, something she did not have a name for and did not want to examine too closely. "You seem familiar," he said slowly, "though I cannot place where we might have met." "I do not believe we have," Elira replied, taking a small step backward. "I am not from this town, and I rarely travel far." "Where are you from, then?" The question, simple as it was, sent a spike of alarm through her chest. She had prepared answers for exactly this kind of moment, but standing before him now, his grey eyes fixed on her with quiet intensity, every rehearsed response seemed to slip from her mind at once. "A small village to the south," she managed finally. "Nothing of note. I came to visit family here in Ashwick." He nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the answer. "Forgive my curiosity. It has been a long week, and perhaps I am seeing familiar faces where none exist." He extended a hand, an oddly formal gesture given the circumstances. "My name is Cade." Elira stared at his outstretched hand for a moment longer than was polite, her mind racing. Refusing to shake it would draw more suspicion than accepting, so she reached out and clasped his hand briefly, her skin prickling at the contact in a way she could not explain. "Ellen," she said, using the false name she had adopted since arriving in town. "Ellen," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. Something in his eyes shifted, subtle but noticeable, and for one terrifying second, Elira feared he had seen through her disguise entirely. But then he simply nodded and released her hand. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Ellen. I hope the rest of your visit to Ashwick proves peaceful." "Thank you," she said, already backing away. "I hope your business here concludes successfully as well." She turned and walked briskly toward the edge of the market, forcing herself not to look back, though every instinct screamed at her to check whether he was watching her go. She did not stop walking until she reached the shop, closing the door behind her and leaning against it, her entire body trembling. Clara looked up from her sewing table, immediately alarmed by her cousin's expression. "What happened?" "I spoke with him," Elira whispered. "The king?" "I walked directly into him at the market and spoke with him, face to face." Clara's face drained of color. "Did he recognize you?" "I do not think so," Elira said, though uncertainty colored her voice. "He said I seemed familiar, but he could not place why. My gift held. My scent remained hidden. But Clara, there was something about him, something in the way he looked at me, as though he were searching for an answer he could not quite reach." "That is precisely the danger," Clara said firmly. "If he felt even a flicker of recognition without your scent confirming anything, imagine what might happen if your control slips, even for a moment. You cannot stay in Ashwick any longer, Elira. It is too dangerous now that he has seen your face and heard your voice, even under a false name." Elira knew her cousin was right, though the thought of living again, of starting over yet another time in some unfamiliar place, filled her with an exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. She had run once already, planned meticulously, executed carefully, and still, fate seemed determined to place her directly in this man's path. That night, unable to calm her racing thoughts, Elira sat by the small window of Clara's back room, watching the moon rise slowly over the rooftops of Ashwick. She thought about the way Cade's eyes had studied her, not with the cold cruelty she expected from a ruthless king, but with something closer to genuine confusion, even vulnerability, as though he too were caught in something he did not fully understand. She told herself it changed nothing. A king known for conquering rival packs through force did not deserve softened judgment simply because he seemed momentarily lost in a crowded market. Reputation existed for a reason, built through actions, not through brief and unremarkable encounters. Whatever strange pull she had felt standing before him meant nothing next to the truth of who he was and what he represented. Meanwhile, across town in the small inn where his men had taken rooms for the night, Cade sat alone by the window of his quarters, staring out at the same rising moon, his mind circling back again and again to the woman he had met in the market. Something about her had unsettled him in a way he could not fully articulate to himself, let alone to Daniel or Owen, who had noticed his distracted mood throughout the evening meal. You seem troubled, my lord, Daniel had observed carefully over dinner. I met someone in the market today, Cade admitted, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. A woman, traveling, visiting family. There was nothing remarkable about the encounter on its surface, and yet I cannot stop thinking of it. Did she carry any scent that matched what you felt during the run? None, Cade said, frustration evident in his voice. Nothing at all, which is precisely what troubles me. A person without any detectable scent whatsoever is either extraordinarily unwell, which she did not appear to be, or she possesses some manner of gift specifically designed to hide such things entirely. Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. You believe she may be the one you seek? I do not know, Cade admitted, and the honesty of the statement seemed to surprise even himself. I only know that something about her presence affected me in a way no other encounter throughout this search has managed. Perhaps it is simple exhaustion clouding my judgment. Perhaps I am seeing connections where none truly exist. But even as he said the words, some deeper instinct within him refused to accept them as true. Something about the woman calling herself Ellen had felt significant in a way he could not dismiss, no matter how thoroughly he tried to explain it away through logic alone. He resolved, quietly and without informing his men of his full intentions, to remain in Ashwick a while longer than originally planned, watching, waiting, and hoping that whatever instinct had stirred within him during their brief encounter would reveal itself more clearly before he was forced to move on to the next village in his search. Neither Elira nor Cade slept easily that night, each caught in their own private uncertainty, unaware that fate, having been denied its moment during the mating run, was already quietly working to bring them together again, whether either of them was ready for it or not. 3 days later, everything changed in a single, chaotic hour. It began with shouting near the eastern edge of Ashwick, followed quickly by the sound of horses moving fast through the narrow streets. Elira had been helping Clara sort through a delivery of new fabric when the noise reached them, distant at first, then rapidly growing louder and more urgent. Clara moved to the window, her face tightening with concern as she watched townsfolk begin running past the shop, some carrying children, others simply fleeing without looking back. What is happening? Elira asked, setting down the bolt of cloth in her hands. I do not know, Clara said, but it does not look good. A young boy, no older than 10, burst through the shop door moments later, breathless and wide-eyed. Raiders, he gasped. Coming from the eastern road, on horseback. They are attacking the outer farms, and people say they are moving toward the market square next. Elira's stomach dropped. Ashwick had no standing army of its own, relying instead on the general peace maintained by the kingdom's borders and occasional patrols. A raid of any size would leave the town almost entirely defenseless, especially if the attackers were organized and numerous. We need to get people to safety, Elira said, already moving toward the door. Elira, wait, Clara called after her, you cannot draw attention to yourself, not with the king's men still in town. People are in danger, Clara. I cannot simply hide while children are running through the streets in terror. She did not wait for further argument, slipping out into the chaos of the square, where panic had begun to spread rapidly among the merchants and townsfolk. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the outer farms, confirming the boy's warning had not been exaggerated. Screams echoed from somewhere near the eastern road, growing steadily closer. Elira had spent years suppressing every instinct that might reveal her wolf abilities, keeping her strength, her speed, and her senses carefully hidden beneath layers of practiced restraint. But standing in the square, watching an elderly merchant struggle to gather his goods while raiders approached, all thought of self-preservation fell away beneath a stronger, more immediate need to help. She rushed forward, helping the merchant clear his stall and guiding him toward the safety of a nearby alley, then turned back toward the square where a group of children had become separated from their families in the growing panic. Without fully considering the consequences, she moved with speed and precision far beyond what any ordinary wolf could manage, gathering the children quickly and leading them toward the shelter of a sturdy stone building at the square's edge. It was in that moment of intense focus, her mind entirely consumed by the need to protect those around her, that her careful control over her scent finally slipped. Across the square, Cade had been moving through the chaos alongside Daniel and Owen, working to organize the town's frightened residents and coordinate a defense against the approaching raiders. His senses, always sharp, caught a shift immediately, a scent blooming suddenly and unmistakably through the surrounding panic, familiar in a way that made his entire body go still despite the danger around him. It was her. The scent from the run. The scent that had haunted him for weeks. And it was coming from the woman he knew as Ellen, currently guiding a group of frightened children towards safety with a speed and strength that confirmed everything his instincts had been trying to tell him since the moment they first met in the market. His wolf surged forward with an intensity that nearly buckled his knees, recognition crashing through him with the force of a physical blow. Every instinct told him to move toward her immediately, to close the distance and claim what fate had denied him weeks ago, but the chaos of the raid demanded his attention first. Raiders were pressing closer to the square, and innocent lives remained in immediate danger. "Daniel, Owen, with me," Kate commanded, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. "We defend the square first. Everything else waits." The next several minutes passed in a blur of coordinated action. Kate's training took over instinctively, directing townsfolk towards safety while his men worked to intercept the raiders before they could reach the market's most vulnerable areas. His wolf, still humming with the shock of finally locating his mate, fought against the discipline that kept him focused on the immediate danger rather than rushing toward Elira the moment he recognized her. Elira, meanwhile, had gotten the last of the children safely into the stone building and turned back toward the square, intending to help however else she could, when she found herself face to face with Kate for the second time in less than a week. This time, there was no confusion in his eyes, no flicker of uncertain recognition. There was only absolute, undeniable certainty. "It is you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the surrounding chaos. Elira's heart sank, understanding immediately what his expression meant. Her control had slipped, just for a moment, but a moment had been enough. "Kate," she said, and for the first time since arriving in Ashwick, she did not bother pretending otherwise. Before either of them could say more, a group of raiders broke through the barricade Owen had helped establish at the square's northern entrance, forcing both of them into immediate action once again. Kate moved without hesitation, positioning himself between the raiders and the fleeing townsfolk, his presence alone enough to give several attackers pause. Elira, her instincts fully unleashed now that concealment no longer mattered, fought alongside him, her movements swift and precise despite years of deliberately suppressing such abilities. Together, they managed to hold the square long enough for reinforcements from a neighboring garrison, alerted by riders sent out earlier in the chaos, to arrive and finally push the raiders back entirely. By the time the last attacker retreated toward the eastern hills, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across a square filled with exhausted, relieved townsfolk slowly emerging from their hiding places. Kate found Elira sitting on the steps of the stone building where she had led the children to safety, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. He approached slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat if she wished, though some part of him suspected, correctly, that running was no longer an option either of them could choose. "You have questions," he said, settling onto the step beside her, keeping a respectful distance between them. "I have many questions," Elira replied, staring straight ahead rather than meeting his eyes. "Though I suspect you have just as many for me." "I do," he admitted. "But perhaps mine can wait until yours have been answered first." Elira finally turned to look at him, searching his expression for any sign of the ruthlessness the stories had always described. She found none, only quiet patience and something that looked remarkably like uncertainty, an expression she had never imagined seeing on the face of a king known for conquering rival packs through force. "Why did you run?" he asked gently, when she remained silent. Elira took a long breath before answering, deciding finally that honesty, however difficult, was the only path forward now that pretense had become impossible. "I have heard the stories about you since I was a child," she said. "A king who took his throne through conflict, who conquered 3 packs before he turned 25, who commands absolute obedience from everyone around him. I did not want a life built on fear, forced into a bond one never chose for myself, married to a man known throughout the kingdom for his ruthlessness." Kate absorbed her words quietly, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, staring out at the square where townsfolk were beginning to help each other clean up the damage from the raid. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Elira had not expected. "My father died when I was 23, he said slowly. killed during a border conflict that our neighboring packs believed they could win by striking first, assuming a young, untested heir would crumble under the pressure of Southern leadership. I did not choose conflict because I desired conquest. I chose it because the alternative was watching my people suffer under leaders who saw our kingdom's transition as an opportunity for exploitation. Every action I took in those early years was aimed at protecting what my father built, not expanding it through cruelty for its own sake. Elira listened, uncertain how much of this to believe, though something in his tone suggested a sincerity she had not anticipated encountering. The stories say differently, she said carefully. Stories often simplify complicated truths into narratives easier to understand, Cade replied. I have never denied the conflicts I have led, nor do I regret the decisions that protected my kingdom during its most vulnerable period. But ruthlessness was never the goal. Survival was. Stability was. And somewhere along the way, I suppose I stopped correcting the stories that painted me as something colder than I truly am, because it served a purpose. Enemies feared me. Rivals hesitated before testing my borders. I let the reputation stand because it protected my people, even as it created exactly the kind of fear that drove you to run from a bond neither of us chose but that fate decided regardless. Elira absorbed this, feeling something shift within her, not complete trust, not yet, but a genuine reconsideration of everything she thought she understood about the man beside her. You could simply command me to return with you, she said quietly. You hold every advantage in this situation. I have nowhere left to run, and you now know exactly who I am and where to find me. I could, Cade agreed. But I will not. Elira turned to look at him fully now, surprise evident in her expression. I have spent weeks searching for you, he continued, driven by an instinct I could not fully explain even to myself, convinced that finding you would resolve everything, that once I located my mate, the rest would simply fall into place. But standing here now, having finally found you, I understand that forcing a bond neither of us chose freely would only recreate the very fear that drove you away in the first place. I do not want a mate who stands beside me out of obligation or fear. I want someone who chooses this path because she believes it is right, not because circumstances left her no alternative. The square around them had grown quieter as evening settled fully over Ashwick, townsfolk retreating to their homes to process the day's events, leaving Elira and Cade largely alone on the steps of the stone building where their paths had finally, irrevocably crossed. What are you saying? Elira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I am saying that the choice remains yours, Cade replied simply. I will not force this bond, regardless of what fate has decided for us. If you wish to remain here in Ashwick, living the life you have built for yourself under a different name, I will respect that decision, however difficult it may be for me personally. But I hope, given time, you might choose differently, not because a bond demands it, but because you come to understand that the man beside you now is not the man the stories have always described. Elira sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had said, the vulnerability so unexpected from a king whose reputation had driven her to abandon her entire life in fear of exactly this moment. Something had shifted within her over the course of this single, chaotic day, though she was not yet ready to name what that shift truly meant. I need time, she said finally. Then you shall have it, Cade replied, rising slowly from the steps. I will remain in Ashwick until you are ready to speak further, however long that requires. There is no urgency here beyond what you decide is necessary. As he walked away, leaving her alone on the steps beneath the darkening sky, Elira watched him go, her mind swirling with questions she had not expected to be asking herself after weeks spent running from exactly this outcome. The days that followed felt strange to Elira, suspended somewhere between the life she had built under a false name and the truth that now stood plainly before her. Cade kept his word. He did not press her for answers, did not send messengers demanding her return to the palace, did not use his authority to force any outcome upon her. Instead, he remained in Ashwick, staying at the small inn near the market square, visible but patient, allowing her the space she had asked for. Clara noticed the change in her cousin almost immediately. You have not mentioned leaving town again, she observed one evening, as they sat together mending a torn curtain by candlelight. There is nowhere left to run, Elira admitted. He knows who I am. He knows where I am. And yet, he has not forced anything. Does that surprise you? Everything about him surprises me, Elira said honestly. I spent years believing the stories, convinced I understood exactly who Kate Thornwood was. Ruthless. Cold. A king who took what he wanted through conflict without hesitation. But the man I have spoken with these past days does not match that description at all. Clara studied her cousin carefully. Perhaps people are rarely as simple as the stories told about them. Elira considered this for a long moment, thinking back to the way Kate had spoken of his father's death, of the pressures that shaped his early reign, of the reputation he allowed to stand because it protected his people even as it created fear he had not fully anticipated. She thought of his patience these past days, his willingness to wait rather than command, his insistence that the choice remained entirely hers. Over the following week, Elira found herself seeking Kate out more frequently, first for brief conversations near the market, then for longer walks along the quiet paths at the edge of town as evening settled over Ashwick. She learned that his sharp exterior hid a man who thought carefully before every decision, who carried the weight of his kingdom's stability as a personal responsibility rather than simply a source of power, and who, despite his reputation, genuinely cared about the well-being of the people he governed. Kate, in turn, learned about the girl who had captured his attention so completely during the run. He heard about her childhood, raised by her aunt after losing her parents young, about her cousin Nora's difficult forced pairing that had shaped her fear of the mating run so deeply, about the years she had spent perfecting her gift not out of vanity but out of genuine desperation to control her own future in a kingdom that offered Omegas very little choice in their own lives. I understand now why you ran, Kate told her one evening, as they walked along the edge of a quiet field just outside town, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. I understand it completely, and I do not blame you for it. I did not know you then, Elira said. I only knew the stories. And now? Elira paused, considering the question carefully before answering. Now I know a man who chose patience over command, who valued my choice over his own certainty, who spoke honestly about his fears and mistakes rather than hiding behind the reputation that protected him. I do not know everything about you yet, Kate, but I know enough to understand that the stories never told the full truth. Kate stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his grey eyes searching hers with a vulnerability she had never expected to see from a king so widely feared throughout the kingdom. I have never asked anyone to choose me freely before, he admitted. Every alliance, every arrangement throughout my reign has been built on necessity, strategy, or survival. I do not know precisely how to ask for something as simple and as difficult as genuine choice. But I am asking now, Elira. Not as your king, not because fate decided this bond for us, but simply as myself. Would you choose to stay, knowing everything you now know? Elira felt the weight of the question settle over her, understanding that this moment would define the rest of her life far more significantly than the night she had fled the mating run weeks ago. She thought of Nora, forced into a bond that had left her joyless and afraid. She thought of the stories that had driven her to abandon everything familiar in favor of a life built on secrecy and fear. And she thought of the man standing before her now, patient and honest, offering her something no story about him had ever suggested he was capable of giving, complete and genuine choice. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I choose to stay. Not because fate demands it, and not because you are king, but because I have come to know the man beneath the reputation, and that man is someone I wish to build a future alongside. Something shifted in Kate's expression, relief and joy mixing together in a way that transformed his features entirely, softening the sharp intensity that had defined him throughout their entire search. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and when she did not, he gently took her hand in his own. Then let us build that future together, he said quietly, not as a king commanding his mate, but as two people who have finally, freely, chosen each other. The bond that had been denied during the mating run finally settled into place, not through the force pull of fate alone, but through genuine understanding and mutual choice, something far stronger than any instinct could have created on its own. Their return to the Blackthorn Palace, several weeks later, looked nothing like the tense, fearful search that had brought them together. Elira entered the palace not as a captured runaway forced to accept her fate, but as a woman who had chosen her path deliberately, standing confidently beside a king who had learned, through their journey together, that true strength required patience and vulnerability as much as it required decisive action. Peter Ellison greeted them both with visible relief, though his expression carried genuine warmth as he studied the change in his king. "You seem different, my lord," he observed carefully, "lighter, somehow, despite the length and difficulty of your search." "I found something during this search that I did not expect," Cade replied, glancing toward Elira with an expression far softer than anyone in the palace had likely ever witnessed from him. "I found a reminder that true partnership requires more than fate's decision. It requires genuine choice, patience, and honesty, qualities I had perhaps neglected in favor of strength and control throughout my reign." Over the following months, the kingdom began to notice subtle changes in how their king governed. Disputes that might once have been settled through swift, forceful decisions now received more careful consideration, more genuine dialogue between all parties involved. Elira, adjusting slowly to her new role, worked quietly alongside Cade, offering perspectives shaped by her own experiences as an Omega who had once feared the very throne she now shared, ensuring that policies affecting wolves throughout the kingdom considered voices that had previously gone unheard. Clara visited the palace occasionally, always amazed at how comfortably her cousin had settled into a life she had once run from in complete terror. "You seem happy," she observed during one visit, watching Elira laugh freely at something Cade had said during a quiet dinner together. "I am happy," Elira confirmed, though it took an unusual path to arrive here. "I do not regret running from the mating run, Clara." That choice taught Cade something important about the reputation he had allowed to stand unchallenged for too long, and it taught me that choosing my own path, even when that path eventually led back toward the very thing I fled, matters more than simply accepting fate without question. Cade, listening nearby, added quietly, "And it taught me that ruling through fear alone, however effective it may seem in protecting a kingdom during difficult times, cannot build the kind of lasting stability that comes from genuine trust and partnership." Elira's courage in running from something she feared, and her strength in eventually choosing to return on her own terms, changed how I understand leadership entirely. Years later, when their reign had firmly established itself as one defined by fairness, thoughtful governance, and genuine partnership between king and mate, the story of how Elira Vos hid her scent to escape the mating run, only to eventually choose the very king she had fled, became one told throughout the kingdom not as a cautionary tale about defying fate, but as a reminder that the strongest bonds are built not through force or inevitability, but through patience, honesty, and the courage to choose freely, even when that choice leads somewhere entirely unexpected. The ruthless king the kingdom once feared had, through one extraordinary search and one remarkable woman's courage, become known instead as a ruler who understood that true strength lay not in conquering everything before him, but in learning when to wait, when to listen, and when to let someone else's choice matter as much as his own. And Elira, once a girl who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing, became instead a queen who taught an entire kingdom that being seen, truly seen, by someone willing to earn that trust rather than demand it, was worth far more than any life spent hiding ever could have been.